You're listening to episode 154 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Willoughby Britton joins us to speak about Cheetah House and the Meditation Safety Toolbox. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. While mindfulness programs may be beneficial, even transformative for many people, it's not the right solution to every problem. Mindfulness can become the hammer with every problem a nail. It's not new that mindfulness-based interventions may be ill-timed, not well presented, or just plain inappropriate in some circumstances, and that can cause harm. But it is fairly recent that teachers and researchers are stepping up, acknowledging that fact, and taking the appropriate ethical actions needed for participant health and well-being. Willoughby Britton, PhD, is an assistant professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University Medical School, an assistant professor of behavior and social sciences in Brown University's School of Public Health, and the director of Brown's Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. Her clinical neuroscience research investigates the effects of contemplative practices on the brain and body in the treatment of mood disorders, trauma, and other emotional disturbances. Our guest today is Willoughby Britton. Willoughby, welcome to the podcast. So good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming. You and I have been talking for several years about the great work that you're doing, and I'm just so delighted to have you here and be able to share this with the listeners, because one of the things that we often talk about in this podcast and other places where I inhabit is the need to share about some of the things we find in meditation and some of the difficulties people may have with it. And so it's just glad to have you here, and wondering if you might start us off by just telling us a bit about your background and maybe what got you interested in meditation.
Well, I think how I got interested in meditation is pretty similar, I think, to a lot of other people's stories, in that I had a big event that kind of rocked my world, and I needed something to help me stabilize. And so when I was in college, my best friend from childhood committed suicide. And that kind of launched me into, I don't know, some kind of anxiety disorder, PTSD, and, GAD, something like that.
Yeah.
And, I was like 20. I thought I was too young to take medication. And my dad sent me a copy of A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield. And that was like my gateway drug. And I carried that book around with me for probably a decade. And it's funny, that book, of all books that I could have gotten, that book was a pretty interesting choice, because, the first couple chapters are really like could resonate with anyone. It's like frequent visitors, noting what's happening, just the kind of basic mindfulness. And then, like, I think it's chapter 7. It's like Kundalini and the spiritual roller coaster. And I was like, I don't know what that is. And so I just like put the book down for like, another 10 years. And then it was like, oh, so it came back around. But it was just a funny choice that was my first book. That was my introduction.
So then about your career trajectory and this intersection and getting involved with studying that. Tell us more about that too.
So I went to the University of Arizona because they had a specialty in consciousness. I was always really interested in consciousness. Just even as a kid, I would say weird things like, Mom, what's looking out of my eyes right now? And she'd be like, oh my God, you're so weird. So I don't know, I just had a really fascination with consciousness, and Arizona was the place to be. So I went there and I was still meditating. I'd been meditating for about 5 years when I got to graduate school. And I did my first study actually on the neural correlates of near-death experiences. So that was an interesting foray into science.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really interesting study. And I kind of realized that being in science is a very privileged position. And there's something about studying this group of people that felt kind of exploitative. And it didn't feel right. Like I didn't feel like if I'm going to do science, I'm going to be a scientist, I'm going to be a clinical psychologist. I want to be helpful.
Yeah.
And so I kind of abandoned that, like, just voyeuristic, I'm going to look at, interesting experiences and people's brains and sort of use people for their experiences.
These are bipedal rats.
Yeah. And I was already meditating and I was getting really into it. And so then I was like, well, this has helped me a lot. So I started studying that. And so my dissertation, and this launches me into a whole different direction, but my dissertation was, maybe meditation, MBCT in particular, maybe that improves depression by improving sleep. Because, having sleep problems is a predictor and a risk factor for depression, and people who, have depression but continue to have insomnia, like, are way higher risk for relapse. So it made a lot of sense. And, like, of course, meditation improves sleep. And so there is my dissertation topic. And so I was going to be the first person to prove this with, like, real sleep, measure sleep teach people to meditate and measure their sleep in the lab with brain waves before and after an MBCT course or weightless control. I spent like 200 nights staying up all night measuring people's brain waves. And then when I got the data back, it was like completely opposite of what I predicted, that meditation practice was actually, positively correlated, not with better sleep, but with more cortical arousal. And I analyzed the data like in every way I could, and every way that I analyzed it, every index of cortical arousal, like, how fast the brain waves were, how many awakenings there were, how many micro arousals, how much slow wave sleep. No matter how I looked at it, it was always the same result. Mm-hmm. And so I really couldn't get around the fact that, like, meditation was actually making people more awake. And, I have to sort of confess that I didn't publish that data for 5 years because it wasn't telling the right story. It wasn't the dominant narrative that was out there, that, like, meditation is relaxing and also all positive. So I think that was, like, if you want to ask me, like, how did you get into studying, like, meditative related challenges and negative effects? Like, this was the first, major kind of like, oh, it's not necessarily what we thought. And then there was another piece that was interesting. So while I was sitting on my data, which is like a very bad thing for scientists to do.
Yep.
I was at a retreat and sort of talking about it with a teacher. And the teacher was like, oh yeah, everyone knows that, like, that meditation makes you stop sleeping. Like, everyone stops sleeping on retreat. Like, of course. Like, why are you psychologists trying to make it into some kind of, relaxation technique?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And it sort of made me realize like how naive I was, or uh how uninformed. Like I had just basically walked into MBSR training, assumed that everything was exactly how it was being taught to us, and never bothered to check. Like
Yeah.
I didn't even know there were like, you know, there were Buddhist texts. I didn't even know those. It didn't even click to me that that was related or somehow important.
Yeah.
So, and as I was saying before the interview started, sort of joking, then I started dating Buddhist scholars, and I started getting some uh, inside scoop into some, because it's not easy to actually to get. You can't just pick up like, a text and read it cover to cover. It's actually, you need some help to help you interpret that. So I started hanging out with a lot of people that could help me interpret those things, and I started learning that, well, actually, there's lots of things in those texts about meditation that is not being communicated to the public and is not in the media and is not particularly desirable. So that was also interesting. And then I think so that was all kind of percolating while I was in graduate school, while I was sitting on my data, while I was meditating, and of course, like also not having like, the 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 blissed out, woman on the front of Time magazine. Those weren't my experiences. I had all sorts of like, weird stuff happening. Definitely wasn't always calm. So that, I was having my own experiences. And then when I got to Brown, I finished graduate school, and then for clinical psychology, you have to do a year-long like residency. It's called internship. And so I got matched at Brown Medical School, and the psychiatry department is actually in an inpatient psych hospital, Butler Hospital. And so while I was on my residency, there were two meditators who were coming off retreat in Western Mass and became psychotic and ended up at Butler Hospital. And, I was thinking 2 in 1 year seems like a lot. Like that's
Horrible and convenient.
and I was like, that seems like a lot. So, IMS and Barry Center is right up the street, basically. So I started going back and hanging out with the teachers there and saying, have you ever seen this before? And these are the same people that told me that, meditation causes insomnia. So I was like, these guys know stuff. So I'm gonna start asking, like, have you ever seen like someone become psychotic? And I wish people could see me right now, because the face that I got was so telling, because it was like this face of someone that like they were busted. Like they totally had seen this before, and like they had to cop to that it was true.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like the first realization that, oh, there's a lot more going on than we're being told. And the meditation teachers know a lot. Like somebody should be asking them. And so that was sort of the revelation that started the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study, which was just a very simple premise of like, let's go to meditation centers and ask the people who run them. Like they've been there for 30 years. A lot of them are like lineage holders in major traditions. They've seen so much, and then just ask them like, what types of challenges have you seen in your students? And that was basically like, this is not a complex design here. This is just like start to ask those questions. And the first thing that was interesting about that was that a lot of teachers would start to tell stories, like get kind of excited, and they'd say, well, when it happened to me. And then you'd be like, well, wait, what? And then many of the teachers had their own stories, sometimes long periods, years of time when they were unable to do kind of standard practice, or they were having some kind of symptom. And I'd also never heard that. And actually one of the teachers I asked, well, you write Dharma books. Like, how come you never mentioned this in your Dharma book? And he's like, well, it's not good advertising. So
Buddhism has a bit of a problem starting with life is suffering.
yeah.
there's that to begin with, but I think that's what you're mentioning here is one of, I'd say, the contributing factors to the problem with people being aware of some of these effects that can happen for some people.
Right.
Is that if your livelihood depends on a particular persona and representation of what it is you're doing, to say, and don't worry, only 3% of the people have a psychotic break, is
God, I
not
hope it's
something
not
that
that
they're
high.
openly going to share. And that's what I'm, one of the things that, you and I had talked about this many years ago, that one of the challenges, if I'm recalling correctly, you had was just getting folks to reply back and say, yeah, we have had this. And we never really keep track of the people who leave during a retreat that
Yep.
might be having some severe problems.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the next, I mean, I think that's the $1,000,000 question, and which is like, how frequent do these problems happen? And what do you mean by these problems is the first question, but how often does something serious like a psychotic break happen? And it's actually a really hard question to answer, for like a lot of reasons. I mean, and one of them is that a lot of times people, because of the way meditation has been promoted as being kind of all positive, and people don't know about the teachers might know, but the meditators don't know. And so that when they start to have something unpleasant or scary happen, they just feel so ashamed that they don't tell anyone, or they're just not sure, like they're just very uncertain, and they're not sure how to communicate it. And then they somehow either just leave the retreat and usually just lie for some, they make up some reason, or they somehow white knuckle it through the end of the retreat and they just leave, and they never bother to call back. So there's really no systematic monitoring, you know at retreats. And weirdly, there's also no systematic monitoring in meditation studies, which is sort of I'm trying to tackle both of those, but for now I'm working on the studies, because that's supposed to happen. Like, it's actually like there's laws and
Yeah.
regulations that, like, nobody's following. And it's not just meditation studies. It's like pretty much any psychological study that's not a drug study, that we don't have as many, like, there's no penalty if you don't do it. And so we just don't do it. And we just declare, oh, there are no adverse effects, except we didn't measure any, but we're just going to say there weren't any because it's
Yeah,
easier
none
than,
found because we
yeah.
didn't look. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting challenge. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else. If you look at most of my early meditation studies, and I just did what everyone else did. It was like, what do they do about them? The journal says, like, you have to mention adverse effects. And then I looked at someone else's who I thought was a good researcher, and, they said there were no adverse effects. So I just said there were no adverse effects.
There's the phrase I can use. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think I'd heard of any, but I didn't measure them, and nobody measures them. So that I'm working on that. Yeah.
And keep working on that, because one of the things that I would say that maybe a lot of teachers are not aware of it. I would suggest that more and more are becoming more aware of it, thanks to your work and our friend David Trelevan and others who are just raising awareness around, it's not all puppy dog tails, and there are particular things we can do to ensure the well-being. And it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be difficulties or challenges that come up. It's kind of part of this too. It's like exercise. You're going to get tired and sweaty. That's part of it. But it's not always going to be bliss. And and to prevent really more serious problems from happening, we need particular education and practice around this for the teachers.
Yep. So David Trelevan and I, and the Buddhist scholar that I married, Jared Lindahl, we run a 20-hour training for meditation teachers called First Do No Harm. And, the centerpiece of that is the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study, which we did finish after 10 years.
Woo!
Started in 2007, published our first article in 2017. There were 3,000 pages of transcripts from interviews. And we interviewed, I think the final tally was 32 teachers and 60 meditators, was the final tally. And we came up with 59 different categories of meditation-related experiences.
Mhm.
So that is kind of the centerpiece of the training, which is, if you're a meditation teacher, you should probably know what those 59 categories are and, be able to identify them and have at least some idea of how to work with them. And if you don't know how to work with them, like where to send someone.
Right.
At the very least, because a lot of meditation teachers aren't clinicians, or even if they are, they don't have time to be wearing that hat, when they're working as a meditation teacher. So,
Mhm.
yeah, that's been a great training to be able to offer, and hopefully there will be a video. We're still waiting to see that come out.
Fingers crossed for you on that. So I'm wondering if you, during that work and during this research, if there have been some common denominators that have been appearing more than others for people who might be having challenges. Are there predictors that we can look for, or is it really just, it's completely flat, it's all over the board?
Well, let's back up a second and just talk about some of the phenomenology, because I think that starts to answer that question. So we did the varieties of contemplative experience study, and that was, looking at a Buddhist sample in different schools of Buddhism, but basically starting at retreat centers. And then we replicated that same study in the same code book in a mindfulness-based program, like the 8-week program, MBCT program. So I think I have a pretty good sense now, and after also interviewing and seeing on a daily basis, like hundreds and hundreds of people, like what kinds of things are going to show up the most commonly. They tend to be symptoms of nervous system dysregulation. So a variety of hyperarousal and hypoarousal and dissociation symptoms. So on the hyperarousal, number one most common is anxiety, but that also can be, it can manifest as psychomotor agitation, racing thoughts, hyperactivity, hypersensitive to sensory like input, like very sensitive to sounds. It can manifest as tics or involuntary movements, flashbacks, or reliving traumatic memories. That's all the hyperarousal one. Oh, insomnia, loss of appetite, and then sometimes when that gets too intense, then people just dissociate. So the hyperarousal and the hypo or dissociation symptoms actually go hand in hand, and then actually you can kind of flip over and go from hyperarousal to I don't feel anything, I don't have any emotions, I don't feel like I'm here, I can't feel my body, I feel outside of my body, everything looks really weird and foreign, I don't recognize myself in the mirror. So those are really just symptoms of nervous system dysregulation, and that can be caused by a lot of different things. So it can be caused by specific practices. I think there's always going to be an interaction between the person, the context, and the practice. So there's always an interaction thing, and I think I've seen pretty much every kind of practice cause problems. I do think that I don't know. I used to think that metta and like compassion practices were like much safer than concentration and vipassana and insight. And then I started talking to Chris Germer, and he was like, nope,
Yeah.
it has its own set of other issues. So I'll let him cover those particular ones. But I think really any practice combined with the right person and, the right, just sort of, so in addition to the 59 categories, we also came up with 26 influencing factors.
Mhm.
And so if you're a math nerd, this is like a regression equation from hell, where you have like, 25 factors all pointing to an outcome, and they all interact with each other. So your question is a very complicated one, but I think maybe the best way to answer it is that a lot of the things we thought were risk factors turned out to be not as straightforward or not as predictive as we thought.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, we looked at, and this is in the VCE sample, does this only happen to people with a psychiatric or trauma history? And the answer is absolutely not. About half of the people that we had that reported problems had neither.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that those things are not playing a role, because I think they definitely are. But the idea that if you don't have a psychiatric or trauma history, you're somehow safe.
It's not black and white. It's not cut and dried.
You cannot assume that. And it also means that I think the idea of screening is somewhat ridiculous. I really don't think you can. I think obviously I don't believe in screening. I believe in assessing. So I think that all teachers at retreats or in schools or wherever you're teaching these practices should know who's walking in the room and know who has a trauma or psych history, just so they can keep an eye on them. But I think that ruling people out a priori because they might have a heightened risk for problems is not empirically supported. And a lot of the people that do really, really well are the people who have all the red flags. People who are they're schizophrenic, they're on medication, sometimes those people really benefit from the practices. So I think we have to be really careful not to freak out and start ruling people out prematurely.
And that's
or thinking that can somehow fix this problem. And rather than no, I'm sorry, you're going to have to actually know how to work with these problems and be, I think that the teacher training focus should be on response,
right.
Not
it's
on
a
screening.
Conversation based on what we're seeing in assessment. It's not you checked this particular box, so no.
Right.
It's having a conversation, getting to know the person, how they are.
Right. And it's also, a combination of, okay, this person has a trauma history, am I trained to work with that? It's really about the combination between what the person is bringing to the table and whether the teacher has the capacity and the training to work with that. And they may, or even the time. Sometimes you're I'm teaching 90 people on this retreat. I just can't be that person to take care of. There's nobody else helping me. So I think it's everyone is, I think, really wants there to be really clear answers. And, I'm going to be an annoying scientist and just keep putting up caveats, because I think it's always a case by case situation.
Yeah.
So psych and trauma, I think we hit that one. I have a couple sort of jokes that I tell. They're not really jokes, but if there's one thing we can say for sure, this doesn't happen to lazy people. That there's kind of there's definitely a zealotry dimension. That was we've been thinking about people who are if you kind of sleep your way through your meditations and skip every other one and you're not very diligent about it, you're probably not gonna get any benefits either, but you're probably not gonna have any problems. And we do see people that run into problems with less than 30 minutes a day. But I think that, as you increase the dose and the intensity, I think there's something happening there.
Well, and especially if they're bringing their own intensity to that as well. It's not just the intensity of the structure, but then they're bringing in their own into the mix.
Exactly. And I think, one of the other risk factors that this is just sort of my clinical observation. There's no empirical data behind this, but maybe I can test it someday, is that I've noticed that people who are really, well, let me just back up and say, one of the things we also found that was surprising in the Varieties project was that not only did our sample not all have trauma, didn't have trauma or psych history, or actually had a lot less than normal, the sort of average distribution of the US population, but they were the top 1% of educational attainment. So these people, it was 75% of them had PhDs and MDs and JDs. And so, obviously they're that's a sign of privilege, but I think that's also a risk factor.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people who are like high achieving, get A's on everything, and are people pleasers, that they do really well in life, and they can be at a risk factor. That can be a risk factor for going a little too far in meditation, because
Mm-hmm.
people who follow rules really well and listen to what other people want them to do, and they override their own needs and their own body signals, that's where people get into trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, I think anytime someone is overriding their own checking in and sense of well-being, how am I doing? Is this challenging or overwhelming? I'm going to ignore overwhelm because I'm supposed to, and I have a goal, and I'm going to attain that goal no matter what. Well, is that really what's most helpful right now?
Well, and there's a lot of messages that I think, there's a lot of messages, period, and going in all different directions. But I think for people that are very attuned to like, well, what's the right answer here? How do I get an A in this game?
Right.
It's very easy to hear things like, the only way over it is through, turn towards the difficult, that there's some kind of valorization of suffering, and that the more you suffer, the more you'll be healed, or you'll make faster progress, or there's sort of a no pain, no gain model, or there can be. And I think that can be a very damaging message, especially for people like that.
Remember, of course, folks listening to the podcast, you'll be familiar with the phrase, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. And then a friend of mine from high school said, yeah, but that which kills us does not make us stronger. So, a little bit of caution, a little bit of appropriate.
From the trauma sensitive mindfulness perspective, you might say that which doesn't kill you might dysregulate you for a long time.
So I want to hear more and give you a chance to talk about Cheetah House and how that got started, what that is, and just kind of give the story of Cheetah House.
Okay, the story of Cheetah House. Well, it has kind of a meandering story. So the original story of Cheetah House is that Cheetah House is a house. I'm actually in Cheetah House. It's on Brown Street in Providence, right down the street from Brown. And the way it came about was because of Brown Contemplative Studies, which is a concentration where you can major in contemplative studies. You can study Buddhist philosophy and neuroscience of meditation, and have retreats count for credit, and it's a really cool program. And there were a lot of students, this is back in 2008, there were a lot of students that were getting super into meditation and then going to Asia and ordaining and coming back as monastics. And Brown has this really stupid rule that you can't go abroad and come back and live off campus. You have to live in a dorm. And so these kids are like celibate. They're like, they don't drink. All they want to do is like count their breaths and read Sanskrit, and being made to like live in these dorms, and like, it just was terrible. So I, as a clinical psychologist, was able to, give them a religious waiver, and basically allow them to live on my third floor. Mm-hmm. So the Cheetah House is just where I live, my house, but I have a third floor apartment, and I was able to basically allow these students to continue their monastic, semi-monastic kind of experiment as they continue to go to college. And then the apartment kind of served the other purpose, where people were thinking about becoming monastics and they wanted to live a semi-monastic life going into retreat. So that was, I mean, the term halfway house is actually pretty appropriate.
Yeah.
And a little bit foreshadowing of what it became too, because as we started the varieties of contemplative experience study, there'd be these rooms that would open up, and we were already like a contemplative house. We had lots of meditation teachers coming through and giving Dharma talks, and people would hear about the study and just feel so, finally somebody understands like what I've been going through. And, we'd have this room available. And so then they'd move in here. And then eventually it just sort of organically became a place where people who were having meditation related problems came to live. And a lot of them would help out with the study. And so Cheetah House became a halfway house for meditators in distress.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ran that for 5 years, from 2008 to 2013. And, it's a great idea. I think it should exist somewhere, the idea of having a residential place where people can go, because some of them are really just one step from being in an inpatient hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But with, really no support or kind of cultural understanding of what they're going through. And very few of them can work, and they just don't have any community. So it's a great thing to have. It's also totally unfeasible, like from a financial perspective, to try to like rent to people who can't work and are like totally dysfunctional. And also, it's a challenge. So the residential dimension of Cheetah House closed in 2013, and has basically now is a nonprofit organization that exists largely online. And so we had a Cheetah House website for a couple years, and the story of the website is really not very glamorous. Basically, it just got hacked, and it was like advertising like Louis Vuitton bags for a couple of years, and I was like, didn't want to do that. And eventually we switched over to Squarespace and have a new website. So we just relaunched that in just a month ago.
Yeah,
it's a lovely really built out the content and continue to. So I encourage you to check that out. It's www.cheetah, like the animal, house, 2h's.org. And you're probably going to ask, why is it called Cheetah House?
I can. Sure. Why is it called Cheetah House?
Yeah. So Cheetah it's just a play on the word chitta, which is variously translated as mind and consciousness, and sometimes even, heart, because the mind and the heart are related. And so we thought it was a nice word that was sort of inviting as a Sanskrit word, and an animal. And it has sort of the idea that the integration between the mind and sort of the sacred and the absolute, and the body, meaning the cheetah body, we are animals. And like, how do you integrate those two things? And that's another kind of ongoing metaphor that I see in these meditation related difficulties is a kind of privileging of the absolute, where people kind of lose their humanity. They forget that they actually exist in a body and like have to pay rent and are animals and have like nervous systems, and like they just want to be awareness or something. And it's just like, no, there's more than that. So the cheetah animal and the Sanskrit word and mind, it all kind of fits together like that.
Nice. And for those who are listening, of course, as usual, I will have links to the things we talk about on the episode page, so you can go to that. Again, it's cheetahhouse.org. And another thing I'll be linking to, and I'm wondering if you can talk about a little bit, is the Meditation Safety Toolbox.
Sure. So the Meditation Safety Toolbox is an online resource that goes with this 20-hour First Do No Harm meditation safety training that we were talking about. And it's for nerds, so be warned. You can download it. I think it's like 60 files or something, and there's all these different folders that correspond to different modules of the training. And so if I can remember off the top of my head what the modules are, there's one on informed consent, there's one on screening, monitoring, management, mechanism, and then there's also a whole bunch of the different mindfulness centers sent us their documents about best practices around like the MBSR curriculum, which now there's a new curriculum, but the old one's in there. And What are the MBCT inclusion and exclusion criteria, and like why do they exist? So there are all those kinds of documents that came from various mindfulness centers, kind of all in one place for people to look at and compare. There's also a new module on trauma-sensitive mindfulness that David Trelevin put in there, and we also have a new one on the very thorny issue of secularity. And, is mindfulness secular? What does that even mean? What are the consequences of that? What are the legal implications of that? Which gets really sticky when you work in schools and any kind of public institution, at least in the U.S. So there's a whole module on that, but there's also a whole bunch of new materials on that, and we update the toolbox kind of whenever we accumulate a pile of new stuff that seems important. But our most recent update was that the key papers in the toolbox were translated into French. Nice. So now there is a French toolbox available in the same place, and there'll be more coming. And if anyone wants to translate anything into any other language, we would be happy to have your help.
Great. So again, for those listening, I'll have a link to that as well. Willoughby, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners, or maybe if you have any recommendations for people who want to start meditation? They know something about it, they want to try it, but might be a little nervous.
There's a big marketplace out there, and people are going to be trying to sell you things. And so maybe before you launch yourself into the marketplace and start looking for products, it might be good to just pause and reflect on what your goals are first, so that you're clear with yourself what your goals are. Because once you launch into the spiritual marketplace, or even the scientific marketplace, a lot of values and definitions of well-being get kind of imposed on you. So you might want to decide, what does well-being look like for me? And maybe even write it down so that you have your own definition of what well-being looks like. And I think that, and maybe also the opposite of how would you know if you weren't getting that? What does not working look like to you? And really be clear about that, because I think, and then once you have that in place, then you can go try out different things and just keep checking back with your definition and your definitions of well-being and your definitions of what does not working look like to you. And that way, you can always be true to yourself, because I think often those things people aren't clear with themselves, and then they're being told that pain is progress, and it gets all flipped and confusing. So I think that trust yourself, trust your body, and be really, really true to yourself and what your goals are, and don't let anybody define what well-being is for you. So that would be kind of my sort of basic thing. And then the second thing is I have a special place in my heart for people who are having meditation related difficulties. And so I just want to walk you through what Cheetah House can offer you. So when you land on the website, you can actually click on a link that says symptoms, and that 59 category list is right there. And if you find the one that you're having, you can actually go across the row, and there'll be a specific resource, like a video or a paper that's on that specific topic. So if you're having problems with dissociation and your sense of self, you can link across and click on the new paper that we just published on meditation related changes in sense of self. We spend a lot of money making sure that all of our publications are open access, so that you don't have to pay the journal to get a copy. We do that for you. So that's the symptoms. We also have an entire section called Get Help. You can get help from various nervous system specialists all over the world. There's a link to find a practitioner. There's also a lot of people that have volunteered to be helpers, who are familiar with the nervous system dysregulation that can happen in meditation, and they've volunteered. So if you are one of those people that knows about this and can help, we can help connect you with people in your region. So we're always looking for helpers and collaborators. You can always set up a consultation with me. I do consultations, and I can help you navigate kind of where you're at, making sense of what's going on, and maybe point you towards some resources that would be appropriate for your specific situation. If you are a reporter or a somebody who's really interested in the research, we have a bibliography of all the scientific studies that have ever been published on meditation related problems, even ones that tried to sort of like not mention it. We link them. And also, my husband put up a section on all the Buddhist sources that also mention meditation related problems. So it kind of goes on and on and on. There's lots of different tabs and resources, there's videos and podcasts. But we really care about you, and we really want to make sure that if you've had a meditation related problem, that there is a place for you to go and there is help, and can recover. It is possible.
Thank you. Our guest today, Willoughby Britton. I'll have links to a couple different things we've talked about today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.